Greetings. This is Hybrid Theory. I'm Aurian Archive. Let's get started. Well, you might have already noticed by now that, unlike previous streams, I'm starting today with a web page open instead of a game. And one of the reasons why I stopped blogging long ago, text blogging, is I found myself responding to every single face palming, moronic, oblivious story that some supposedly prestigious tech site posted. My blog basically became nothing more than counter arguments. The only thing I could ever talk about was something that somebody else did. I could never talk about stuff that I was interested in. I was always feeling that I had to pounce on somebody who put something out there, being paid to put something out there that was demonstratively false, and had no research done whatsoever. I mean, not even opening up a Google search. I mean, we all know that Google's now filtering results aggressively. We know Google's not accurate. That's not up for debate. But even if you do just a simple Google search, you can generally find some maybe not inaccurate information, but maybe not accurate information either. And where I'm going with this is I really wanted us to keep talking about the Steam Deck and how the Steam Deck is the anti-Steam machine, how it's the culmination of everything that Valve has learned about making hardware and developing software and making a product that people want to buy. And then I saw something incredibly, just mind-blowingly, head-tiltingly, "Are you serious?" written from TechCrunch. Now, I had never heard of TechCrunch before. I think it was, what was this webpage, 2010, when I heard about the Crunchpad. Before then, I had never heard of TechCrunch. It was, I'm not going to say they were off the radar, but I didn't know about them. I didn't know who they were. I have no idea who this Michael Arrington is, and quite frankly, I never cared. Where I'm going with this is that back in, as you can read through the timeline here, and as far as I can research, the history that Wikipedia cites does appear to be accurate. It is not inaccurate information. But Michael Arrington got into the tablet business without understanding the market in any significant way, without having done the research about his partners, without having done the research about the ODMs, the OEMs. He knew absolutely nothing about how to bring a product to market and what was involved, and he promptly got his butt handed to him on a platter by a third party that, as you can read here, that screwed Michael Arrington over. You would think then that after having lost a significant amount of money, after having basically been run roughshod over by a product market he didn't understand it, somebody who runs, owns, founds a tech site would make sure that do your research is a fundamental part of every article posted. You don't post article if you've been through that kind of financial loss, you should not be posting articles that have okay, let me put it this way. If you said that you were a big fan of Metal Gear Solid and the Metal Gear series, and you knew everything there was to ever know about Metal Gear Solid, and you didn't know who Kojima was. I mean, someone said, "What about Kojima? And, what do you think about him leaving?" And the person said, "Oh, all about Metal Gear Solid." So they go, "Kojima who?" You instantly know that person has no credibility. It's like somebody saying they are a big fan of Nintendo. They love Nintendo. They played every single Nintendo game. They have every single Nintendo product. And you look at them and go, "Well, what do you think about Miyamoto's upcoming project?" And they tilt their head and they look at you and go, "Who's Miyamoto?" They've instantly lost all credibility. It's like somebody who says, "I'm for net neutrality." Okay, have you read Zarias' theorem on what net neutrality actually means? Who's Zarias? You haven't done your research. You literally don't know what you're talking about. You have not done basic research at all. If these are just three examples, and that's where when I saw in the Google approved newsfeed, and again, established for a fact here, Google is pushing propaganda. Google is not a serious news organization. Google is using the Chrome newsfeed on Android to push stories to form an opinion that they want people to have. It doesn't matter that Google's pushing outright lies, it just matters that it's propaganda to force a certain perspective, a certain expectation, a certain response, be it emotional, be it a real world, do something response. That's the only purpose of the Chrome newsfeed, is to agitate by using text stories to agitate. And it's literally straight out of Pravda from the USSR. It's the same kind of strategy. Yeah, you might tell a story, but you're deliberately pulling information that's vital in order to get somebody to react or act the way that you want them to. And the story that Google chose to push, that was published on TechCrunch, is that the poisoning of the Linux kernel by a major, we'll put that in quotes, major American university is the end of open source. And that's the best sound I can get of my face hitting my palm. The massively big problem here, and we're just going to do a quick search to frame the massively big problem here. We're going to look up TrueCrypt. TrueCrypt was an open source free disk encryption software, and it was discontinued on the mere suggestion, no proof, but mere suggestion, that U.S. intelligence agencies had placed backdoors into TrueCrypt. Let that sink in for a second, will you please? And while you think about that, I'm going to go ahead and get the game back up because I don't think we'll need the browser again. And I'm going back to what I was doing last time, which is badge hunting. I think I'm just now finishing off the Praetoria badges. And so while I go through the badges, we'll talk about why TechCrunch publishing an article stating that, or suggesting that, or implying that, or even asking if poisoning the Linux kernel deliberately by college researchers is the end of open source, why it was such an astoundingly, mind-numbingly, I'm literally at a loss for words. This is almost as bad as, opening up a Super Reflexes build and seeing that somebody has no soft caps to anything. Okay, it's actually worse than that, because to be fair, the build video I just did, and person who did it, they had never done a build before. I mean, never. It was like their first build ever, and I really do need to do a build theory video on what you're looking for when you are creating a character in City of Heroes. And that might be very helpful to that player, because I'm looking at things that they don't even know to look at yet. And, well, we'll get to that when I get to it. But for now, let's focus on TechCrunch. And why was that such an astoundingly... Why was it a bad choice to publish that article now? Well, as I just showed with TrueCrypt, attacks being made on open source software by surreptitiously inserting covert backdoors has always been a problem of open source. It's always been a fear. That risk has always been there. You go back to the origins of the open source licensing model, and the original theorists who worked out how the licensing systems could work or should work. And most of them were in colleges. They were trying to get access to the computer systems that they were using, and were told they couldn't get access. They did not know how the software was working. And even then, this is at the first stages of the idea of software written and executed on a processor, separate of being hardwired into the first Turing complete architectures. Even I am going to have something to drink near, because I feel this one's going to be a shouty one. And I'm thinking about changing out the microphone and trying to SteelSeries headset. I've been using the Razer Kraken Kitty Ears edition, and after listening to myself on the SR build video, I'm kind of going like, do I really sound that terrible? Yeah, probably. Well, I'm getting distracted from the point, because I really don't want to talk about this, even though I have to. Because this is basic research 101. What went wrong with open source early on? Well, you had many people involved in the computer industry who didn't understand. Their bosses didn't understand. Their owners of the companies didn't understand that being able to look at and view the software was critical to understanding not only how the software worked, but what could be done with that software. And very early on, the idea of bugs, which at first were physically moths and other flying critters, roaches that were uh, caught in mechanical machines that were software bugs in the literal sense, debugging code, finding out what crashed, is important to a smooth operation. It's incredibly important. And if you don't know what the code is doing, if you have no idea what the code is doing, then you have no real way to debug the software. And if you obviously, I'm never going to get that word out. If you hide what's in your code, or you try to encrypt it or otherwise disguise what's in it, all you do is introduce the chance for more bugs. And there are several wonderfully written extrapolations, treaties, whatever you want to call them, on how to design open source software that is still secure. When you build a security system, you assume that everybody knows how the locks work, how the lock works, and even if they know, and if your security system is good, even if everyone knows the physical machinations, the actual mechanics, the how it works, if everyone still knows that and your lock still works and is still a lock, then you've probably made a pretty good lock. And this applies to software. If everyone knows how the security works and the security still works, then you've probably written pretty good security software. But very early on, at the very beginning stages of open source software, and the concept that the software itself should not be disguised or hidden, it needed to be out, it needed to be understood. There were already people who were trying to close the software down. No, you can't look at it. No, you can't see it. Well, if you're closing the software down, what don't you want people to see? Why would you close the software down? And that's always been the fear of proprietary software. You have no way of knowing what's in the software. Even if you don't have the technical expertise to read the source code yourself, you can hire somebody who now has a vested fiscal, FISCAL, fiscal responsibility and interest in making sure that they do the job that they are being paid to do. There is a level of trust between you paying somebody to look over code who is technically qualified and them actually looking over the code and telling you whether or not there's something wrong or not wrong with it. And as we flash forward from the very beginning of open source years, from the very first Xerox systems and going into the Microsoft years, we really come to a loggerhead. When Microsoft's legal department was more known for sending cease and desist than, well, I don't really have anything else polite to say here. There were so many people who took pot shots at Microsoft's legal department was running the company, and everyone who worked in marketing actually worked in legal. Second. Okay. Going forward then, at the very beginning of when Linux began, of when the idea of a Linux kernel, of an open source system, of when the news not Unix operating system came around, when all of that was being done, a great focus was put on the developing of the software in the open, that there would be no doubt that the news not Unix operating system was not Unix. It was not illegally derived from Unix source code. It was not illegally copied from trademarked and owned Unix sources. I'm pretty sure that was redundant. And the Linux kernel, again, we have a very firm history, a documented trail of where the Linux source code, how it began, what all was involved, who all was involved. There is a documented trail of all the commits, of all the changes that are made. And one of the big factors in those early operating, in the news not Unix, in the Linux kernel, trust between programmers was vital. In fact, some operating systems even took a little bit further. Debian, for example, requires that all maintainers physically go meet in person a new maintainer. That there is nobody who gets commit access to the Debian operating system without having physically met with, talked with, identified with, been vetted by somebody already vested in the project. It just doesn't happen. There is no way that I know of to make an unsanctioned commit to the Debian, to anything in the Debian operating system. You must go through the security procedures. And most other open source projects have the same kind of verification system. Nobody's allowed to make a change blindly. And part of this has been the desire to enforce that everybody has to be verified, everybody has to have their code checked by a maintainer, that the maintainer has some level of trust. This is a function built into open source. Wow, did I just say sauce? Open source software development. I'm combining soft and source like it's one big sauce. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist the joke. The predication then for open source software, the very real predication behind it, is that there is an inherent trust, and when that trust is broken, bad things happen to those who break the trust. And for a second, we'll get political here. In the Republican Party, when Governor Sanford of South Carolina was proven to have been, proven to having committed adultery with a mistress while telling everyone that he was hiking or on a bike trail or someplace where he was not. When that was proven, Governor Sanford's time in the Republican Party ended. He was kicked out. It didn't matter how much he apologized. It didn't matter what he did after that. His career as a Republican was over. Now you compare that to someone like Kamala or Kamala or Kumala or whatever she wants to call herself. I don't care anymore. When you compare it to someone like her, and her cock of choice was what? Willie Brown out in California? I think that was the guy's name. And you didn't exactly see the Democrats throwing either Kamala or Brown or any other adulterous former president, Bill Clinton, out of the party. You didn't see them effectively, in a political sense, excommunicating the offending person from the party. No, you can basically commit any crime, commit any ethical breach. You can pretty much do anything that you want to in the Democrat Party, and you will never be kicked out. You will never be disinvited from attending the convention. All that matters is that you say, I'm a Democrat, and you uphold the party line and you vote the party way. As long as you do that, nothing else you do matters. On the Republican side, though, Republicans actually believe what they say. Republicans actually do believe in what's in the Republican platform. They do believe that America is a great country because it's founded on Judeo-Christian values. They do believe that a republic is the best form of a limited government. They do believe that the government should get itself out of anything the government has no vested reason to be in. And you just go down the list. And for the most part, Republicans tend to be Judeo-Christians who really do hold true and believe the values and act upon the values they say they believe in. There's the bet they missed. That's not true in the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party has no standards. It has no ethics. It has no morals. Everything is relative. Everything changes. And there is nothing anybody can do to get themselves removed from party influence outside of stop being useful to the party. That's pretty much the only way to get kicked out of the. This is new. Oh, we've got more tunnels. Sorry, I'm used to like the tunnel being down here at these gates. I'm not sure when this was moved, but I haven't been badging over here in an issue or so. All right, so hey, everyone gets to watch along as they go. What's that? All right, bringing this back around to TechCrunch then. Basic research. I mean, just a fundamentally basic research of open source projects, history of poisoned code would quickly show that Microsoft's legal actions in courts and the threatening overture made by the Business Software Alliance and thugs showing up to businesses demanding you either buy Windows licenses or they're going to take all of your computers because you don't have valid Windows licenses, even if none of your computers were running Windows. And yes, that did actually happen. There were multiple cases cited in the antitrust trial against Microsoft, and Bill Gates was found guilty on all those charges. Keep that in mind. He is a convicted criminal. You can't get away from that. You can't undo that. It is a conviction proven in court. And this really matters because the open source software communities were deathly scared of Microsoft hiring developers to poison any project. And it has long been a fear of countless open source organizations that somebody from Microsoft was going to be the boogeyman and come in and start inserting random code to just destroy all their hard work. Now, in hindsight, we know that that never really happened. We now know, largely thanks to Satya Nadella, that Microsoft's internal development was too chaotic, too splintered, too faction driven to really drive home a concentrated, concerted, concise, pinpoint precision poisoning of an open source project. Microsoft, for all its bluster and obnoxiousness, was never a real threat because of everyone who was effectively incompetent. The only way Microsoft could advance, and again, this is established fact, not conjecture, we know this, the only way Microsoft could advance this software was to steal the idea or the software itself from someone else outside of Microsoft. Now, I'm not saying that's true now. We are, again, going back to the 1980s, the 1990s, probably most of the 2000s, pretty much all the way up until Ballmer left the company. This is probably true. After Ballmer left the company, after Satya took over, I really don't know how many people dumped and ran. Just discarded the evidence of crimes and got the hell out. But keeping that in mind, keeping that open source has almost from its inception been under an assault from vendors, from other software vendors, from people looking to make a quick buck. The idea that open source, the model itself, is vulnerable to poisoning completely ignores how almost all open source projects are set up, how they are configured. Is the root of trust. Who made this? Who compiled this? Who wrote this? And who signed off on it? Who even cleared those commits to begin with? It's literally somebody's job in an application or program to review code changes. To speak to City of Heroes, which I'm playing now, we ran into very early on the secret server a problem with a developer who wanted to do a new archetype, had never coded anything before in his life. It was his very first attempt. And that's the kind of person that you're going to bend over backwards, but they have to do something else in return. They just can't make the archetype and walk away. They have to follow certain rules, and that means follow certain coding practices. If that developer's not following coding practices, if they're either incapable of or simply don't want to follow the coding practices, then it's the job of the maintainer to say, sorry, we can't use your code. I'm the maintainer. I can't fix your code every time. I can't take time every time I run a build, every time I make a new executable, every time I do that, I have to fix your code in order to make my code work. No. You need to get your code, you need to test it, you need to make sure that you've made all the changes that are needed to your code in order for it to operate with the upstream code. If you're not willing to do that, you, sorry, we can't use you. And it's, some people have asked, well, why haven't you ever contributed code to City of Heroes? And I kind of go, you do realize that a room full of spider monkeys with nail guns shooting at keyboards would likely produce better code than me for this kind of game, right? I mean, come on, my expertise was in AI, and not today's neural network driven AI. I mean, as in Lisp driven, hardwired AI. That's what I'm versed in, and those aren't skills that even if I was current on them, even if I was still doing that kind of work, which I haven't done for 2 decades now. Over 2 decades. I think we're getting close to, going to be coming up on 3 decades since I cracked open a programming book. I'm not very useful to something like City of Heroes. Yes, I do have enough exterior knowledge to sit outside, look at the code and go, that's not right. I do have enough knowledge that every time the secret devs explained what was going on with the code, that I could understand just how bad it was written. I could understand the implied damage from contract developers who were just paid to show up, get a job done, and move on, who didn't have time to learn the coding practices of the company they were hired by, who didn't have time to meet any interior design guide. They just had to get it done and then get off the clock. And when you're under that kind of pressure, it's very easy to make mistakes. It's very easy to leave black boxes of code that only you understand and no one else can understand. And if anyone wants to do anything about it later, they have to reverse engineer it and figure out what you did. Either rewrite the function that your code is supposed to perform entirely and just replace your code, or just build blocks around your code. And that's what happened with KDE 3.x. When people couldn't understand what the code was supposed to be doing, rather than rewrite the function, they just wrote around it. And then you got nice little heaps of code that has no documentation. Nobody knows what to do with. Nobody understands why it works like it's supposed to work, because nobody has any information on it. Code documentation is important to the long-term success of a project. And again, that's bringing it back to TechCrunch. A lot of this should be basic research. If you didn't learn it in your first year computer science course, you need to go have words with your teacher, because they didn't actually, if they're not teaching you the history of what it means if they're not teaching you the practical realities of what it means to be writing code, the impact that your code will have on someone else, of the bus factor of what it means, what if you no longer can maintain your code and someone else has to. All of those are important basic block fundamentals. And open source, very early on, learned the hard way that the software vendors, the hardware vendors, the proprietary companies, they weren't interested in proper code practices. They weren't interested in doing things the right way. They were just interested in making a buck as quick as possible. And when that's your motivation, you naturally, if you are somebody who is in it to do a good job, because that's how you make your money, is you do a good job and then you get recommended because you did a good job. If that's how you earn your living, you're going to do your level best to make sure that any project you work on doesn't suffer from the kinds of problems that a malicious coder could bring. And that's why the poison code for the Linux kernel was caught. The reason the university didn't get away with it is that the platform function system, however you want to describe the layout, the configuration of how code is submitted to the kernel, it worked. Somebody looked at the code and went, that doesn't look right. Can you explain what's going on here? That doesn't look right. Can you explain what's going on here? That doesn't look right. Can you explain what's going on here? And as you start as the maintainer, the person responsible for signing off on the inclusion of that code for that function does their job, they can quickly determine whether or not they are being given code that requires a deeper look. Give me a second. Sorry, I'm being messaged in game by one of the players who had asked about the Alec SR build, and I'm going like, I literally was just talking about that in the current stream of it was the player first build. They had no idea what to look for. I mean, uh, I really, since they might actually be tuning in right now or checking the past couple of minutes, I kind of want to focus on that for a second. It's when you're building a character in City of Heroes, you really have to have an idea of what the character does first, and you really get into a chicken or egg situation. This was one of the reasons why I, for years, hated mids on the live server, because people would just go and grab a build without any idea of what the character did. And if you're making a build without knowing what the character is supposed to do or how it's supposed to play, you can quickly find yourself with a build you can't personally play. And that's kind of, I'm more okay with doing that with this live stream format, with talking about the build as I'm making it, as I'm explaining what's going on with it, what the logic is. Because if I can walk somebody through what the logic was of making a build, if I can explain to them, this is why you wanted this power here, this is why you want this proc here. Hang on, I'm going to see if I can. Okay. Okay, now that's weird hearing myself about on the delay. Let's cut that off and uh, we'll come back to it. Anyways, it's if you don't know what you're looking for in a character, if you really don't know what you're looking for, you don't know what the character is supposed to do, you don't know what his strengths or weaknesses are, someone can hand you a build and it may look awesome on paper. It may have soft cap defenses. It may have a really high recharge. It may have a great, fantastic regeneration rate. But you can hand some characters a really good regeneration rate, say 500%. We'll just use that number off the top of my head since I'm not actually looking at a build. But if you have 500% regeneration on a defender, you're still only clocking like 12 or 13 HP per second, which isn't a lot. It's really not. So that's keeping in mind what the build is supposed to do, what the strengths of the powers are. And it's like, I know that Super Reflexes is all about the defense. It is a set that is built to, catered to, uh, you dodge everything, is you feel the bullet moving towards you and you just shift out of the way. You feel the punch coming towards you and you shift out of the way. You feel the air crackle around you and the rain before it starts to fall. You dodge out of the way. Super reflexes is all about getting out of the way of the positionals. It doesn't. Yeah. YouTube not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. As such, viewers will experience buffering. Yeah, no duh. Yeah, well, if I get stuck on that, I'll be ranting about T-Mobile for a while. It really, if you're doing streaming video, T-Mobile Home ISP isn't quite ready yet. But like I was hammering them on that with Mixer. It's just not ready yet. It's only when I think T-Mobile starts rolling out the 5G connection for home users that you will realistically be able to stream at least maybe a 1080 feet out. I'm not even doing that. I think I'm streaming it like I think I said OBS to like 1200 by 800, maybe 720, to try and keep the outgoing under the physical limitations of what the stream is capable of what the network stream is capable of. Don't get the network stream and what I'm doing confused. That's just awkward. Okay, going back to the TechCrunch, the end of open source, complete. The only way you could really publish an article saying that the poisoning of the Linux kernel could be the end of open source, open source communities, open source projects have been dealing with people trying to insert poison code either as a joke or as a research project for longer than I've literally been alive. Uh, we're going back. Just this is where I'm really at a loss for words as is how can you write any kind of article like that and not have any kind of grasp on, because of Microsoft in particular, because of Oracle, because of IBM, because of all these other tech companies that have come and gone, because of Nokia, because of Trolltech, because of insert tech company here. Open source has constantly been under assault from people, from entities, from businesses who have an agenda and will do anything to reach that agenda. Now, whether or not they're capable of actually reaching that agenda is an open question. Again, as in the case of Microsoft, for as much fear, doubt, and uncertainty as Microsoft. What the? Sorry. Okay, just checking here. Am I the only person who's. The map is saying there's a door here? I don't see no door. I don't see no clicky. Huh. If anyone from Paragon Studios is watching this eventually, what's this about? I really would like to know. Is it something that comes? No, there's no other way in here. There's just an on the map, 90-degree turn. That's on the map, but nothing's there. Was something there at some point? That's supposed to be a hatch you can go through? Doesn't look like it. Nothing down below. Well, that's just weird. Okay. Back to. I keep getting easily distracted, huh? The thing is with TechCrunch and just the publishing of the article, there's this thing in journalism called journalistic integrity. I mean, if you've actually been to a classical journalism school, if you've actually learned how to write a story, how to ask who, what, when, where, why, when you've actually learned how to function as a journalist, you cannot write any story without having the professional, uh, I don't want to say decency, the professional integrity, if you will, to at least research past events to see whether or not this is something that's happened before. Is there a recognizable pattern? Is there a determinable pattern? And in the case of Linux software security and open source software security, yes, there is a very recognizable pattern of attacks over the years. As the Chinese Communist Party has become more and more aggressive, attention has fully turned towards, in many security circles, to guarding against insertion of malicious code into open source projects by the CCP. Now, the CCP does have one thing Microsoft never had. a near endless supply of forced labor who have nothing else to do but to sit at a computer and think up of ways to make someone else's life miserable. I mean, it's part of me, kind of would say I would hope that's where does that? Oh, I know where that door goes. That's a mission door if you're leaving. When you're leaving, where am I at? I'm beneath. I'm in Nova, so yeah. We'll be up topside in a minute. Or at least we should be. Actually, knowing me, I could be a lot longer, just rambling on, because I keep getting distracted and finding other things to talk about. The thing is, research is vitally important. Knowing contextual information, knowing history, having a grasp on the implications and results of that history. Open source is not going to die because somebody managed to get some code that was poisoned a certain way up the chain. The system effectively worked. Maybe it didn't work as fast as some would have liked it to work. I mean, some fairly accurately ask, how was this even written in the first place? I mean, I don't mean why did the university choose to write poison code. I mean, and how was it not recognized as poison code so early? I mean, was this a failure on the maintainer? Did they just trust the people submitting the code too much? I mean, if anything, the attempt to push poison code into the Linux kernel will cause a lockdown. And a number of open source projects, they've done this in the past and they'll do it again, and they'll just pause all work and just do an audit of the code. They'll audit all changes, they'll run all the tests that they can run, and they'll start, asking specific questions of people if they come across something that's maybe not adding up. Maybe it's just an integer that didn't carry over. Maybe it's a floating point that's formatted incorrectly. But every time that there's been an assault on any open source project in the form of poison software in the past, the open source community, those who actually believe that software should be open source so that you can look at it, so that you can study it, so that you can learn from it, so that you can know exactly what the code is doing. Those who those who operate on those principles will not fall for poison code. They just won't. They'll be interested, if they see something that's not adding up, if they see functions that have no clear definition, if they see something in the pull request that I'm not sure how this works. Could you please clarify it? And if you go on a Linux kernel mailing list, the LKML, there are list after list after list of people who don't understand, the upstream maintainers who don't understand what function a code segment is supposed to do. And that's why it's broken into pull requests, little bits of pieces of code at a time, not a single group of codes, not a massive whole paragraph. It's little bits of code, lines at a time, functions at a time. And when you have a major staging request, when you have something that's a really big package, say you're dropping out an entire driver package and you're just replacing it outright. Those kinds of packages get even more scrutiny and even more eyes pour over those kinds of packages. Because it really does matter understanding what the code is supposed to do. And it's also, if you understand what the code is supposed to do, you can better optimize the code. You can figure out what code can be taken out, what code can be refactored. That means rewritten. What code is just there for fluff. If you've got something that's collecting trash cycles on every clock, and you only really need to collect a trash cycle, or you have an automatic garbage collection, you can take that kind of code out. Excuse me for a second. And that really, really matters. So, to conclude, because I really want to get back to talking about the Steam Deck, TechCrunch, your writer is full of it, and I don't even know why you would ever employ that person again. I'm not saying that they need to write a retraction saying they published a story without doing basic research, but they published a story without doing basic research. It's really that simple. Now, to address the overall worry, the actual concern of is open source vulnerable to trust attacks? Yeah, sure, it is. But I don't think anybody in any open source project at any time has ever denied, ever questioned that trust is a very huge factor. There have been kernel developers, and I'll single out Conman Con Calivas, Snake Oil Supreme Salesman, who routinely shows up with this scheduler nonsense, and those who don't understand what schedulers are supposed to do and how schedulers are supposed to operate looked at Conman Calivas' schedule and went, hey, he's onto something. No, he was on something. There's a difference. There's a big difference. And it's something to keep in mind that some people are in it for the fame alone. Conman Calivas, all of the stunts that he's pulled have always been about his own personal glory, always been about making a name for himself over and above other Linux developers, many of whom you don't know. You'll never know. I mean, Greg Crowe Hartman, unless you are a kernel developer, you probably wouldn't be able to pick Greg out of a crowd if you ran into him on the street. He's not some celebrity, but he's done some of the most critically important driver work, getting applications to work with specific hardware accessories. He's an unsung hero who has done more to advance how systems actually work, the internal underlying layers, than any other developer. I mean, if anybody should be a household name of what they have contributed to modern day computing, it's Greg Crowe Hartman. But he's not a household name, and he never will be, because he's not an attention seeking prostitute. I have never known Greg to deliberately go out and try and make a name for himself. Yeah, he's gone out and he's landed a couple of body blows on some loudmouths, and he's taken a couple hits back. He does get in and scrap every now and then. But he's not really the kind of person to run to whatever insert big website here now and scream, I've done this, you should praise me, which Conman Calivas keeps doing over and over and over and over and over and over. I really don't like Conman Calivas. All right. And again, that's another point where just basic research, basic history, knowing that there, and it's not just poison projects, poison code, poisoning projects that have been a problem. It's also been developers who, like Conman Calivas, are unethical to begin with. They don't adhere to any sort of code of conduct. They don't adhere to any sort of trust pattern. They just do whatever, and if you don't do things their way, they go and make a big noise about it that they've done this great thing and you're just ignoring them. No, they're ignoring you because you didn't do a great thing and you need to shut your mouth. Yeah, like I said, this one felt like it was going to be a shouty one. And yes, some of this I've realized I'm going back and I'm looking at history, but that's important. Now I'm sounding like Dan Bongino. It's important. This is important. It is important to understand that history, to understand that open source, Linux, OpenOffice, LibreOffice, the Apache web server, every project has been through its share of developers who have gotten ticked off, and maybe their last pull request was just a outright troll. A completely nonsensical attempt to disrupt a project. But if the open source systems work, if the structures and guides that have been put into place by the maintainers function as they should, if the maintainers do their job and check the code, actually check it, look it over, read it, can they understand it? If they can't understand it, why can't they understand it? And to be fair, if you're writing, say, like a driver for a trackball, and you're writing something to interpolate the position of the spheres, and you're including that in the driver itself rather than in an external library, and you submit that driver to the maintainer. Here, I've written a new mouse driver for trackballs, and the maintainer's looking over it, and they go, I don't understand. Why are you looking up these interrupts? Why are you looking up these positional items? I mean, well, why don't you do that through an external library? I mean, we've got things to read those kind of inputs. We just need to know what the hardware we're talking to, its device addresses. We need to know what capabilities it has. Why do you have this information included? And the coder comes back and says, I didn't know that there was a library to interpolate trackball positions pre-existing. I will rewrite my driver to use that external library now that I know about it. And then the maintainer goes, good, get back to me when you've made that rewrite. It really can be that simple. And somebody who just, because of the size, scale, scope of the project, doesn't know what it's capable of, doesn't know if something exists or not, doesn't know if they have other options. But that's the job of the maintainer. That's the job of the person who actually checks the code and signs it off that they have looked over this code. It meets their expectations. It is something that is usable. It is something that is viable. It is something that can be then pushed upstream into the main project. And because of that kind of system, I mean, Linux kernel has it. Every major open source project that I know has it. You just don't write something and then publish it, and then everyone goes, cool, you wrote a patch, we'll integrate it right now. No, that doesn't happen. A concern here, what about lazy maintainers? Maintainers who don't want to check the code? Well, in a case like the Linux kernel project, you have multiple stages. All right, we're going to be going real quick into the game. I'm now going after one of the most annoying badges to get, the River Rat Exploration badge. Now, as I go over each of these markers out here in the water, there should be an incrementing gauge somewhere here in the exploration badges. And so now okay, okay, there we go. We're looking for that, kind of keeping track of that badge count. Whoa, hello. And here's the thing, where I showed in a previous stream where you could get out and get the denied service badge. If you try to get into some place like here, you will be defeated by the preventative measures long before you can reach the other side of them. Okay, we're coming up on. We've got number 2. Yeah. So we'll get all of the badges around here, and we'll try and do this in the order so that when we go to the next map over, we will have the correct number of badges earned and be able to start counting again. So we come up here, we're looking for number 3. And no number 3. Okay, there we go, number 3. We've checked that badge. We've got one coming up here. So we'll just keep our eye on that. And I guess I really am trying to think of something more to say, but I just kind of, for me, on TechCrunch's article, I just kind of come back to Michael Arrington, who founded TechCrunch, suffered major problem with the Crunchpad because he didn't do basic research. And it's one thing, I get it, for like CNN or Fox News or ABC or NBC or Associated Press or Reuters, I get it. None of the writers, none of the newscasters are being paid to do research. They're being handed scripts to read, and they're depending on the production staff to have done something. They may not know what, they're just depending on the production staff to have done something. And it's one thing if your production staff isn't interested in basic research. If your production staff isn't interested in research at all. If all your production staff is interested in is the story that gets the most clicks, the story that gets the most shares, the story that gets the most reactions. And you don't care if those reactions are positive or negative. You don't care if those reactions are for accurate information or inaccurate information. If that's what your production staff, if they don't have, if your production staff is not willing to do the work required to make sure that you are what you say on camera is accurate, then you deserve all the scorn and hatred and vile looks, the responses, the people screaming fake news at you. If you just trusted in your production staff and you know that your production staff deliberately had you do something on air that was inaccurate, immoral, unethical, maybe we'll even go just plain wrong, but you did it anyways, you don't have a defense. I mean, if you are a journalist, or if you claim to be a journalist, and you don't know who, what, when, where, or why, you are not capable of asking who, what, when, where, or why, if your stories aren't framed around who, what, when, where, or why, then you're not a journalist. You're an opinion writer. You're just writing an opinion. You're not actually asking questions. Now, if you pitch yourself as an opinion person, if you are openly a Dan Bongino, a Tucker Carlson, if you are openly saying you're here to ask questions, you're here to give an opinion, then that's one thing. That's if you are positioning yourself as an opinion person, you can get away with saying things that are not necessarily true because it's your opinion. It's how you read the situation. Is that the right thing to do? Well, maybe not. Maybe sometimes taking the time to do the research is more important. And good journalists have people who will help them do that. Friends, associates. They'll have someone who will say, well, here's your cited source. This is why we went with this wording. And we think this wording is accurate. If it's not accurate, we'll have you say it's not accurate later. And then we'll just post the accurate story because then we've got more information. We can work on that. If that's how your news organization works, then great. You're probably doing a pretty good job. If that's not how your news organization works, if you just read a story, hear a story, see something, and then just trot out the typewriter, plug in whatever thoughts running across your head, you're not a journalist. I'm not even sure what I'd call you. And what's really insulting to me, as somebody who's put in the time before to do the research, to ask the questions, to try and find answers, when I see somebody who gets paid probably way more than I do, and they just can post whatever they want, whether or not it's right or wrong, and somebody picks it up and runs with it without even checking to see whether or not it's right or wrong. In a word, it's demoralizing. In another word, it's kindling. What it does is it forces an unfavorable opinion. Simply being wrong for the sake of being wrong, simply saying things for the sake of saying things, and then just knowing that you'll get away with it because it's not your fault. You didn't know. Well, if you didn't know, then why did you do it in the first place? And that's really where I keep coming back to TechCrunch, and I keep coming back and thinking about that it was Google pushing this, the end of open source headline. It was Google who decided we want people to see this article. We want people to be doom and gloom that open source is coming to an end, that there's poison pills around every corner, that any project could be taken over from inside by code that's been upstream, that nobody knows what it does because it's a poison pill. And everyone who's already been through this, time and time again, everyone who's dealt with a hostile code writer, everyone who's dealt with somebody who doesn't have the best intentions in mind in their commits, everyone who's been down those paths before all it does to people like us is it detunes the rest of any content you carry from our consciousness. It's not that we don't see it. It's not that we ignore it. It's just that we discard it. it and I don't think TechCrunch understands this, and they really should, because it's been vital to almost any website. It's vital to almost any news outlet. It's vital to anyone, even people who just do nothing but write opinions. And that if you just say things that are completely wrong, that you can't prove, that there's no logical path to it, there's no reasoning to it, it's just you said it, therefore. And then someone comes along and says, well, that's not right. And then they prove that it's not right. And then they start citing examples from memory of that not being right. And then you go and look those examples up and you go, wow, this other person, they really knew what they were talking about. Wow, this TechCrunch place, they're not hiring very good people, are they? You've done worse than just detuned people from your site. You've done worse than just given people a reason to discard whatever your site does. You've now ruined everyone else on the site. Because now all the other writers who may put in good work, who may do the research, what happens to their content? A serious question. If you are versed in open source software, open source development, the threat that it has faced, the very real threat that have been enacted against it in the past, and then you see somebody shout, "This is the death of open source," and you just tune them out, and then you look and see who published them. And this is the case with Matt Hartley, permanent troll. I don't know where he's at. I really don't care where he's at. Where if you just troll people and that's all you do, you form a reputation where people who know that you're a troll will announce that you're a troll, will make it clear that you're a troll, will keep bringing up that you're a troll. And then what's worse is that reputation will keep following you, no matter where you go, no matter what you do. Now, and again, we'll tap into the political side here, if you're a Democrat, you can do that all day long and still get hired. You can go on CNN and say, just repeat the absolute untruth over and over and over, and you'll still be invited back. And just for the record here, I'm not saying that Fox News is any better on this, because they keep bringing back Geraldo Rivera and Juan Williams. And I'm quite frankly, I've said this out loud. I've said it to hosts before, and I've said it to their faces. They should get combat pay for getting put in the same room with those two. If you go in, and again, there is the excuse there that people like that are opinion writers. I mean, Geraldo still kind of sometimes pitches himself as a journalist, but he's not. He's an opinion person. He had ceased to be a journalist a pretty long time ago. And that's really kind of a shame for journalism and all. Because if we look down the list of everyone who we thought we trusted, the big names in news, and then we read the stories about them now from people who were close to them, and we look back and we see the actual historical impact, and we learn the unclassified documents, and then we learn what really happened. And then that opinion we had of those people, it can't ever go back to what it was. We can't ever look at Tom Brokaw the same way again. We can't ever look at Peter Jennings the same way again. We can't look at some of the news stations again the same way either. We know that they're hostile. We know that they have a political axe to grind, and if you're not on board with that political axe, then they're going to be swinging that axe at you. Personally, professionally, it doesn't matter. And that's a really scary thing here. And that what happens when things reach a boiling point? When does the straw break the camel's back? At what point do people go, "You're lying," and then react? What's that reaction going to be? And that's why I really wanted to focus on what TechCrunch did, or in this case, did not do. for the most part, technology sites have been immune from the relations and associations with political reporting. I mean, there's only so many ways you can spin a technological story. You can be pro AMD, you can be pro Intel. You can be anti AMD, you can be anti Intel. You can be pro Nvidia, you can be anti Nvidia. You can be pro Qualcomm, you can be anti Qualcomm. I mean, you can have a clear point of bias when it comes to reporting on tech stories, but it doesn't really matter what your bias is. It really doesn't. I mean, you can slag on AMD all day long, all you want. You can bring up every single idiotic maneuver ever made, but you're a tech site. I mean, I don't want to say who cares. I mean, if people want to see what you have to think about the situation, it becomes abundantly clear that you have a bias one way or another. And the reason it becomes abundantly clear is that consumers, people who actually buy things, eventually get their hands on that same hardware. And if you had a bias against a certain product and the actual consumers have a very different point of view, they already tune you out anyways. If you have a bias and it shows in a tech site, you attract the people who confirm your bias. You don't attract the people who disprove your bias. And it happens on a much more rapid scale than it does in a political, on a nightly news channel or on a nationwide cable network. And the reason it happens so much more quickly on tech sites is again because consumers actually get their hands on the hardware very quickly. There's only a matter of days or weeks, sometimes months, between somebody saying something, writing something, posting something. Excuse me. It, anyways, sorry. Days, weeks, months. Oh, nah, I need to get another drink. Woof. Days, weeks, months, whatever, until other people get their hands on the product. And okay, I'm going to pick on myself for a minute. I really like the Steam Deck. I really think that Valve is doing lots of great things here. I really think they have the best direction they can take to get done what they want to get done. That's my opinion. And that's the opinion I will probably have until the Steam Deck actually gets in my hands, if I get one. As I commented to somebody else who may or may not be watching the stream, I kind of cracked, I'm kind of, if I'm a good boy, maybe Santa will have a Steam Deck for me for Christmas. And it's not exactly a secret. I've got lots of medical bills. I'm routinely post about it. And I don't ever really go into what's wrong with me personally. Because I grew up in a culture where you didn't share your personal problems with outsiders, where you didn't talk about what was wrong with you physically. You didn't whine or complain. You didn't beg for money. You didn't beg for help. You just shut up and you dealt with it. And I've had it pointed out to me more times than I care to count now that if I had been a little more open, a little more talkative, a little more communicative about what was going wrong with my body, about what's gone wrong with me, then maybe people that I knew years ago may have known somebody who could have known somebody who could have helped. Maybe I could have been in a medical program. Maybe I could have been in a research study. And maybe I wouldn't have had to go through all the physical pain and I don't want to use the word torture, but when your own muscles rip themselves apart from the inside, when your tendons and ligaments hold, when it's the muscles themselves that strip end to end, when that happens, what other word is there than torture? What other word is there than torment? Does pain does pain even have a meaning anymore? Can you ever understand pain again? And I realize we just went to a really dark place here. And as you know, when I come back, shout something, it's important. And in some ways, it is important. It can be important. I really want to get my hands on a Steam Deck, but I'll be the first person to admit that with the medical bills I have, with everything else that's going on, I'm probably not going to have the money. I'm really not. I mean, I want one. I really need to upgrade my computer. And I'm a little amazed. We're going on here, what? Uh, let's see what OBS says. We're going on lifetime 1 hour, 10 minutes. So we're getting close to where we've crashed out before. And sorry, someone just texted me in chat and trying to figure out how to say to them. I'm in the middle of streaming right now. I have no idea what's going on because I'm not even looking at another channel. Okay. Where are you? Oh, there you are. I'm right next to you. There we go. Going Rouge. It's during the research, sitting from the outside, and one of the things going back to, I I desperately try not to talk about myself. I mean, it, I desperately get away from the camera. I try to hide what's going on with my voice. I try to hide how my lungs have been destroyed. I try to hide how my throat isn't that great. I want to hide everything that's wrong with me and just people to see the perfect picture image, a mental image, a mental construct, one that I can convey. But is that a mental construct? Is that image? Is it an accurate one? And yeah, it really does matter. It's the reputation that people get. It's the reputation not just for how they acted in the past, but how they act in the future. These are things that really matter. And when you do something so egregious as a journalist, to post something demonstratively untrue, demonstratively no research, demonstratively not even an attempt to understand basic fundamental concepts, you, as I said before, you're not just hurting yourself. You're not just because someone out there will probably hire you again. Someone out there will probably give you a paycheck to keep doing whatever you've been doing if you adhere to a certain political ideology. And right now, for some political ideologies, the Communist Chinese Party, there's a pretty good incentive to defeat open source. And that incentive pretty much is the Android project. Android open source is still a thing. As much as Google tries to take more stuff out of Android open source and put it behind proprietary Google programs, the core construct of Android and the core kernel it uses are still open source. Anyone can compile, can code, anyone can look at them. And this means that if you buy a handset from China, from Red China, from the it's built in the CCP and it uses a stock Android that you can compare compiled checksums to that has an unlocked bootloader that you can put your own version of Android on. I mean, compile it, install it yourself. Then you can be pretty sure that the CCP doesn't have any spyware that's on there because you've gone through and checked the code yourself, because you've done the work yourself. And it's that reputation, it's not doing the work yourself. knowing that you trust a vendor, knowing that you trust that somebody hasn't messed with it, and you're pretty sure that they haven't messed with it because the hash sums check out. No pun intended, no redundancy intended. And that's another important factor that's missed here is that open source software, almost by default, because it's managed through open repositories that require signing rights, excuse me, it requires signing rights. Sorry, I was pausing there while the game loaded, uh, because we know how easily distracted I can be. Oh, it's on the other side of the wall. See, I'm easily distracted. There it is. Those open source repositories, the work that you have to do to make a commit, you just can't come in, slam the door open, shout, "Ani, I'm here," slap a post on the wall, and everybody just uses it. The CCP hates that. They hate that idea. They hate that concept. They hate the construct of it because it locks out a method for the CCP to install spyware into the mobile platform that a vast majority of Chinese OEMs use. And if Chinese citizens can be fairly certain that the handset they bought does not have CCP malware installed on it, it makes it that much more difficult for the CCP to track and trace dissidents. It makes it that much more difficult to identify those who are not adhering to the party line. And it makes it that much more difficult to bring those malcontent slaves back in line. The CCP has a vested interest in destroying open source software as we know it. The CCP has a vested interest in forcing people to distrust open source as a general rule. Because once people start distrusting open source, then it becomes that much easier to push a proprietary clone program that is much more egregiously easily, and yes, I do not use those terms incorrectly, egregiously, easily, in combination, in conjunction with each other, to interfere with and add specific software actions to permit specific physical actions, aka designing a software that spies on the end user. Excuse me. The CCP thus has a vested interest in discouraging or pushing stories that sow distrust in open source software. And you're kind of going, but the CCP certainly have better things to do than to push stories into Google News. Do they? Really, do they? We're talking about the same political party that literally paid trillions, if not, I haven't done the full calculations, quadrillions of US dollars to buy out and maintain calculatory control of digital currencies. We're talking about a government that hijacked, in some cases at weapon point, as in armed CCP soldiers showed up with weapons drawn and forced factories producing graphics cards to hand those graphics cards over to the soldiers at weapon point. And no, I'm not making that happen. We have at least, I think, 7 documented cases now, maybe more. I'm not sure what the total count is up to. A couple of them, at least, were shot with high altitude drones. And we also know that the people who took those photos, they were identified through the drones, and some of them are missing. We don't know. We literally don't know where they are. What do we think happened to them? I can tell you what I think happened to them. I'm pretty sure that once they were identified, they're either in the Uyghur concentration camps or they're already dead. And that's why this is so critically important. It's not just destroying trust in a website. It's not just destroying journalistic credibility. It's not just Google being a jerk. It's about a geopolitical conflict. And my cat has just decided to show up, giving me a positive thought in the middle of all this misery. It is the overt actions of an entity that has a very political axe to grind with a very politically oriented goal, leveraging willing businesses. And we don't have proof that Google is currently being funded by the CCP. We can theorize that because we know that the return on investment in Google Ads is cratering, where businesses that reported returns on investment of 25, 27, 28% are now reporting negative investment numbers. They're actually losing money using Google Ads, and they're thus withdrawing ads from Google platforms, and yet Google is still raking money in? Where's that money coming from? A serious question. Where does Google's money come from? And it's not from enterprise customers. Those numbers don't add up. It's not from ads. Those numbers aren't adding up anymore. So who's bankrolling Google? Is this a giant money laundering operation we're talking about? Is Google using the claims of advertising to hide a financial investment from the Chinese Communist Party? I think the proof there is to say yes, but will that proof wind up in front of a U.S. senatorial or U.S. congressional commission with, uh, in this case, it would be a Republican congressman or a Republican senator going, hey, Google, we got this information here. It says that you accepted 17 trillion yen from the CCP to, what's this, discourage the use of open source software. Isn't your business founded on open source software? And those are the kinds of questions you won't ever hear, or, well, I don't want to say that because in 2 years, assuming the Democrats' massive fraud machine can be defeated, which can be, there are certain ways to defeat it. If you're looking for a quick primer, if you're a Republican or an independent, don't vote early. Or if you must vote early, vote the latest you can before early voting closes. The Democrats use early voting numbers and the metadata associated with those numbers to target where votes need to go. The less time that you give the Democrats to figure out where votes need to go, the less time the Democrats have to get operational operations or operational personnel in place to enact the cheating procedures. The less time you have for the Democrats to figure out, okay, we need 500 more people to show up at this precinct. And that's real quick primer. And some people have always thought, what do you mean early voting's used as a weapon against Republicans? Going, well, if you early vote, even if you haven't told who you're voting for, even if you didn't answer an exit poll, because the polls are supposed to be secret, you can have poll observers. And the Democrats literally pay people to go stand or sit in polling precincts and just keep track of not the voting action, whether or not they see anything suspicious going on at voting machines. I mean, they're Democrats. They're the ones doing the suspicious things at the voting machines. It's that simple. They're looking rather at the metadata. Who walks in clean shaven? Who walks in with what skin color? Who walks in that was driving a Mercedes? Who walks in that was driving a Mazda? And they use that metadata to then, excuse me, they use that metadata to then extrapolate a picture of what they think the people who did show up did vote for or who they would vote for. What does their personal appearance, what does their personal hygiene, what does their personal mode of transportation, what does it say about that person? And if you have an idea of what that person is like, or what they sounded like, or how they walked, or their mannerisms, and you have a good read on them, you may have a pretty good idea of how they voted. And even if you don't know for a fact that they voted Democrat or Republican or Independent or whatever, or if they voted voting candidate, you have a pretty good idea within a delta percentage range of how many people you're probably going to have to overcome in order for your candidate to win through cheating. Limiting early voting is one way. I mean, just vote as late as you can if you must early vote. Otherwise, vote on the day of the election is less time for Democrats to gather that metadata and pool the resources they need to figure out what numbers they need to put where to commit the fraud. And this comes back to, and since I've now literally made this story by TechCrunch a geopolitical question, a question of did the Chinese Communist Party pay for TechCrunch to run that story? Well, I don't know that for certain, but I do kind of have to ask if you were an actual open source vendor or you were you've had any kind of product that is a tech product in any way, and you were involved with open source in any way, and you read that story, would you advertise on TechCrunch? Serious question. Would you? Well, the obvious answer is you wouldn't. You'd look at that and go, I'm not giving them any money. In fact, if anything, you'd pull the advertisement just on one story because its story is intentionally damaging to the construct of open source, not just insulting, it's openly attempting to be damaging. And when you can keep that in mind, you didn't have to ask, well, who does buy ad space then? And it's a real question. Who's buying ad space? Who's paying TechCrunch to post these articles? And when you answer that question, when you look at who the advertisers are, and then you can look at who's backing them and where that money is coming from, you might have your answer, and it's not probably the answer you think it's going to be. Yeah, I already did the research on this one, and I've already spelled out what it is. But since I'm at the end of the badge run, I've gotten, let's check fast travel here. Not fast travel, the long range teleport. And we are complete. I have, right here. I'm in Neutropolis. I've unlocked every other zone. Let's do our, not exploration badges, but we're going to do our accolades. And we should just have a flood. Alright, this one, that's Rick the Warzone. I need to get on a mothership raid with this character to get the badge in the middle of the mothership. Uh, what badge did I miss in Brometown? Alright, we've missed one. We've missed a couple. Looks like in. Oh, uh, I'm not 45 yet. Why does this look like. It's not Eden. Brickstown, Paraguay. That's Talos. Uh, Let me check real quickly. It's got to be a hazard zone. And we want misunderstood. Yeah, it's Harvey. Yeah, make it little kitty cat. Misunderstood badge. Founders Falls. Okay, let's zip over to Founders Falls and get the rest of those badges. Easily distractible, huh? Alright. Well, I'm actually tempted to cut it here. And because I really want to talk about the Steam Deck, it's getting late and I really need to get some food. So I'm going to park at the train station, I think. And we'll cut it here for tonight. And if anyone is watching this, thanks for hanging with me through the rants and distractions. If anyone watches this in the future, It's been nice having you along for however long this has been going on. What does OBS say we're up to? We are 1 hour and 29 minutes. So an hour and 30 minutes with no GPU crashes, and we appear to still be streaming. So hey, that's a plus. So that's it for now. I'm Aurian Archive.